So IPA was pretty much reserved just for the officers and the higher ranking people.
Okay.
The export India is what the majority of the troops would have gotten.
But like the IPA back then was like not.
No, it was hugely hoppy. Like what we actually a lot of our interpretations of English beer is only based off of the last 70 years. In the early 1910s, is when it was actually 1917 is when the government in the UK officially like put in this new beer tax. That basically if your beer was above 3.8%, you got a tax. And then if it was above 4.5, you got a second tax. It was even bigger. And that's what led to all of these beers going down in ABV. Anything pre that, most British beer was extremely strong. It was rare to find a beer under 6%. During the 1800s, a mild, the weakest mild you could find was 5.5%. The strongest mild you could find was 13.
Okay.
So it was just due to taxation, lack of ingredients during the wars, because they couldn't get things from Germany or the Czech Republic. That's what led to, and then taxation led to what we consider traditional British beer. It's actually not right.
Scottish like 60 shilling ale, that's like a tax base.
Absolutely. Like the whole thing about like anytime you talk about the Scottish shillings, like really a 60 shilling ale can be any color. An 80 shilling can be any color.
ABV,
it has nothing to do with that. Exactly.
Crazy.
It has to do with how much the beer costs. That shilling is totally related to the ABV of the beer because they're taxed based on that.
Okay.
So that's how all of those terms came about. It's something that I'm really trying hard to educate people on, is that English beer is not inherently weak. That's a very modern interpretation of it. It's hard. I've done a few beers recently where I put out a pale ale, and it was an English pale ale, and it was almost 7% alcohol. And it was 105 IBU. And they're like, this isn't an English pale ale. I'm like, it is. The recipe isn't mine. This is out of a book of a guy that has collected brewing records from every brewery from the start of the 1800s through. And this is what they did.
Well, I feel like defining beer styles is a modern thing. Like back then, they didn't have BJCP guidelines. They're just like, hey, we make beer in this town, and this is what we make.
Yeah. Mild nowadays means this low alcohol, typically dark, or unless it's a pale mild, but it's very low ABV, and it's this like one note kind of beer. Mild really just means young beer. Mm-hmm. It didn't matter what kind of beer it was. It could have been a porter, a stout, an IPA, anything. Mild was just young, fresh beer. Mm-hmm. It was not aged. That's all it meant. So in 1917, the first two breweries that really embraced the tax thing made what they called government ale. The term government ale, people didn't like it because they hated the fact that their beer was getting weaker because the government was taxing it. So they had to drop that name, and that's when they just made mild your lowest, weakest beer. But that was the only reason that happened, is because people wouldn't buy government ale because they were mad at the government for changing the rules.